Imagine for a moment that you are standing before the hills of Latium on a misty, humid morning almost 3,000 years ago. There are no traces of columns, no marble, no echo of Latin reverberating through the streets. Only small villages scattered among the hills, shepherds, and a river that does not yet know it will one day be called the Tiber, witness to the birth of one of the most influential civilizations in human history. That's where our story begins, not with emperors, armies, and conquests, but with myths and mud. Every great empire needs a good founding story, and Rome was no exception. The legend of Romulus and Remus has survived not because it is necessarily true, but because it reveals what Rome thought of itself. Two twin brothers, sons of the god Mars, and a Vestal princess, abandoned in a river, nursed by a she-wolf, and raised by shepherds until they became leaders. The foundation of Rome in 753 BC, according to tradition, occurs after a fratricidal quarrel. Romulus kills Remus and becomes the first king of the city. A violent beginning? Of course, but also a profoundly symbolic one. Rome is born from conflict, and not only survives it, but turns it into its driving force. Although we now know that this story is largely mythical, the truth is that Rome arose as a blend of cultures, tribes, and customs. Archaeological evidence tells us of a collection of Latin and Sabine villages that gradually merged around the Palatine and nearby hills. In its early days, Rome was not an empire, not even an important city. It was just another settlement on the map of central Italy in the region of Latium, where Etruscans, Latins, Sabines, Volsci, and other peoples coexisted, traded, and fought among themselves. The first Roman kings were probably more real than legend suggests, though their history is so shrouded in the mists of time that separating myth from reality is like trying to reconstruct a broken vase from a single shard. What we do know is that Rome, sometime between the 8th and 6th centuries BC, was ruled by a monarchy, and that several of these kings, such as Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, or Tarquinius Superbus, left important marks on the city's early formation. Under Etruscan influence, Rome began to transform into something more than a cluster of huts. From them, the Romans learned construction techniques, religious practices, and social organization. The Cloaca Maxima, one of the oldest sewer systems in the world, dates from this period. The first organized temples and the Forum as a public gathering space also appeared. Yet Roman history always had a tense relationship with absolute power. The figure of the king gradually lost favor among the people, and the final straw came with the tyrannical rule of Tarquinius Superbus. In 509 BC, according to tradition, the Roman people rebelled. The immediate cause was the crime committed by Sextus Tarquinius, the king's son, against Lucretia, a noblewoman whose rape and subsequent suicide sparked the flame of change. But it was not just a matter of honor, it was a matter of power. Rome said enough to the rule of a single man, and in an act of collective will that still echoes through political history, they abolished the monarchy and proclaimed the republic. Do you realize how powerful that is? A civilization that chose to organize itself without kings or monarchs, but under the rule of laws, senators, and elected magistrates. The Roman Republic was far from perfect. In fact, it was brutally unequal, but it planted a seed that centuries later would inspire Renaissance thinkers, French revolutionaries, and even the founding fathers of the United States. The beginning of the Republic brought profound institutional changes. The system of consuls was created, two magistrates alternating power, elected annually to prevent its concentration in one hand. The Senate was established as a permanent advisory body, and other magistracies were created, such as praetors, quaestors, aediles, and censors. But beyond the names, The important thing here is to understand how Rome began to build something unique, a political structure that sought, through institutions, to contain the ambitions of men. However, the Republic was not a democracy as we understand it today. Political power was reserved for a minority, the patricians, aristocratic families who claimed descent from the founders and monopolized public office, land, and prestige. The plebeians, the majority of the population, had little participation. This imbalance gave rise to one of the longest and most decisive social struggles in Roman history, the conflict of the orders. For more than 2 centuries, the plebeians protested, withdrew from the city, the famous secessio plebis, and gradually expanded their rights. This struggle was not only political, but deeply social. They wanted written laws, and achieved them with the law of the 12 tables. They wanted access to magistracies, and eventually they gained it. In this process, Rome refined its institutional machinery and learned to resolve internal conflicts without self-destruction, something few civilizations have managed with such pragmatism and endurance. Meanwhile, Rome did not stand still. From its earliest days as a republic, expansion was a constant, first against its closest neighbors, Latins, Sabines, Etruscans, and later in broader wars for dominance of the Italian peninsula. It was not just about territory, it was about survival. Rome was surrounded by hostile powers, and to survive, it had to defend itself, grow, incorporate allies, subdue rivals, and build increasingly complex networks of power. Here emerges one of the keys to Roman success, its capacity for integration. Rome did not merely conquer, it knew when to punish and when to grant. To the subdued peoples, it offered partial citizenship, legal rights, and limited participation in its system. Thus, it created loyalty and diluted resistance. This political flexibility, this talent for absorbing rather than simply destroying, was what allowed a small city in Latium to become the center of a world. And so, without emperors or imperial armies yet, Rome was already laying the foundations of something far greater than its first citizens could ever imagine. The world did not yet know Caesar, Augustus, or great enemies like Hannibal or Mithridates. But the stage was already set, the foundations were laid, and the drive toward absolute power, though no one yet knew it, was unstoppable. When the Roman Republic began to consolidate its internal power, its gaze naturally turned outward. It was as if an unstoppable force drove it to expand, to control, to project itself beyond its borders. But this was not a hollow ambition. For Rome, expansion meant guaranteeing its security, preventing others from dominating it, and above all, spreading its values, its language, its culture, and its unique vision of order. By the end of the 4th century BC, Rome was already an important power in central Italy. The Samnite Wars, fought between 343 and 290 BC, were a turning point. The Samnites, a fierce and proud mountain people, were for decades the main obstacle to Rome's expansion southward. They were not easy enemies. Their knowledge of the terrain and guerrilla tactics put the Roman legions in trouble more than once. But Rome learned quickly. It might lose battles, but rarely lost wars. After a long series of clashes, it managed to subdue them, opening the door to the domination of southern Italy. This process of conquest was not purely military. Rome established strategic colonies, built roads to facilitate the movement of troops and goods, and applied its policy of integration. The defeated peoples were not annihilated, but assimilated intelligently. Some were granted the status of allies, others received citizenship without the right to vote, civitas sine suffragio, and a select few obtained full citizenship. This network of alliances made Rome the nerve center of power, not only possessing its own resources, but also those of dozens of communities that, willingly or not, fell within its orbit. But then, destiny presented a new challenge, one far more ambitious, complex, and decisive: the confrontation with Carthage. To grasp the magnitude of what occurred between Rome and Carthage, we must imagine two completely different civilizations with distinct origins, cultures, and interests that were inevitably destined to collide on the board of the Western Mediterranean. Carthage was a Phoenician city-state located in present-day Tunisia, which for centuries had controlled vast maritime trade routes. Wealthy, sophisticated, with a powerful fleet and colonies in Corsica, Sardinia, Sicily, and even southern Spain. Rome was still essentially a land power, Carthage a maritime one. A new rivalry was being born. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BC, was Rome's first great international war, and also its first encounter with a power that matched or even surpassed it in some aspects. The struggle was centered mainly on Sicily, an island that became the battlefield between two models of civilization. At first, Rome had no fleet, and Carthage ruled the seas. But, in a typically Roman act of ingenuity, they copied a captured Carthaginian ship, built a navy from scratch, and developed a boarding device called the corvus, a movable bridge that turned naval combat into hand-to-hand fighting where Romans excelled. The war was long, bloody, and ruinously expensive for both sides. Yet Rome emerged victorious. As a result, Carthage lost Sicily, Rome's first province outside Italy, and was forced to pay a massive indemnity. It was not only a military triumph, but also the moment when Rome leapt from a regional power to one with imperial ambitions. But Carthage did not surrender. Years later, another, far more terrible and legendary conflict would forever mark Rome's collective memory: the Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BC. And here appears one of the most unforgettable names in all of ancient history: Hannibal Barca. This Carthaginian general, endowed with a brilliant strategic mind and an indomitable will, decided to attack Rome in a way no one expected, by crossing the Alps with an army, including war elephants. Imagine the scene: exhausted men, animals unfit for the climate, snow, hunger, and yet an epic march that left the world breathless. Hannibal not only reached Italy, but also inflicted some of the most humiliating defeats in Rome's history, such as the Battle of Cannae, 216 BC, where the Romans lost tens of thousands of soldiers in a single day. Rome stood on the brink of collapse. Many thought it was the end. But this is where Rome revealed its true character. Instead of surrendering or negotiating, the city resisted. It repelled Hannibal from its gates, reorganized its forces, and adopted a war of attrition. While Hannibal failed to capture Rome, the Romans carried the war to Africa, to the very heart of Carthage. There emerged another key figure, Publius Cornelius Scipio, known as Scipio Africanus. Young, charismatic, and daring, he defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama, 202 BC, and sealed Carthage's fate for the second time. Rome's victory not only consolidated its hegemony in the Western Mediterranean, but also allowed it to acquire new provinces: Hispania, Corsica, and Sardinia. It was the beginning of a network of control that, within a few years, would stretch from the Atlantic to Asia Minor. But this expansion came at a price, and not only an economic one. Rome was changing. Contact with Hellenistic cultures, the constant influx of wealth and slaves, and its new role as an imperial power began to alter Roman society profoundly. The Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BC, though less spectacular, carried tremendous symbolic cruelty. Urged on by factions demanding Carthage's total destruction, Rome besieged the city for 3 years. When it finally fell, it was utterly annihilated. It is said that the land was plowed with salt, so that nothing would ever grow there again. And so, Carthage vanished from the map as a power. Rome had shown not only that it could win, but that it knew how to eliminate anyone who dared to challenge its supremacy. With Carthage gone, Rome turned its gaze eastward, toward the Hellenistic kingdoms that had arisen after the death of Alexander the Great: Macedonia, Greece, Asia Minor. Unlike its confrontation with Carthage, Rome now faced a collection of divided kingdoms plagued by internal rivalries and political decay. It was like pushing open a half-closed door. Between 200 and 133 BC, Rome annexed much of the Greek world, establishing provinces in Macedonia, Greece, and Asia. But something curious and profound occurred. While Rome conquered Greece militarily, Greek culture conquered Rome spiritually. Architecture, literature, philosophy, and even religion became infused with the Hellenic spirit the Romans so admired. From the hardy peasant soldiers of earlier generations, Rome now filled with rhetoric, art, refinement, and educated slaves who served as tutors to the elite. This fusion of Latin and Greek would give rise to a new and powerful civilization, the Greco-Roman culture. However, not all was harmony. The wealth from conquests, new territories, and the endless flow of slaves created enormous social inequalities. The old republican Rome, austere and agrarian, began to disappear. Lands were absorbed by a landowning elite. Small farmers sank into poverty and migrated to the city, and Rome became crowded with an idle, frustrated urban population easily swayed by demagogues. It was the perfect breeding ground for the social tensions that, in the next phase of history, would erupt into increasingly violent internal conflicts. Rome had conquered the world, but in doing so, it began to lose its internal balance. The swords that had once been raised against external enemies would soon turn toward the heart of the Republic itself. Expansion had brought power, but also corruption, inequality, and a new generation of ambitious leaders willing to do anything for control of the state. Up to this point, Rome had been an unstoppable expanding force, forging an empire upon the foundations of the Republic. But now, that very expansion began to turn against it. What had once been its greatest strength, territorial growth, the domination of foreign peoples, and the accumulation of wealth, became a source of internal imbalance. Social tensions deepened, and the Republican political system, which had functioned successfully for centuries, began to show deep cracks. One of the most visible breaking points was the growing inequality between rich and poor. While the aristocrats, the optimates, amassed fortunes from land and spoils of war, the small landowners, once the backbone of the Roman army, were being displaced. Many returned from military campaigns to find themselves homeless, as their lands had been sold or abandoned in their absence. Without property or resources, they could no longer enlist as soldiers, directly weakening the military engine that had sustained Rome's conquests. The city of Rome, which had grown enormously, became a hotbed of unemployment, resentment, and political clientelism. The rich offered bread and entertainment, panem et circenses, to keep the masses content, while the Senate seemed increasingly detached from the people's real needs. It was then that figures emerged who sought to reform the system from within, and the first to attempt it paid the ultimate price. The brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus were the pioneers of this movement. Tiberius, elected tribune of the plebs in 133 BC, proposed an agrarian reform that would limit the amount of public land the wealthy could own and redistribute the excess among poor citizens. The proposal struck a nerve. Senators saw not only their wealth, but also their political influence threatened. Tiberius was murdered in a riot organized by senators. Years later, his brother Gaius tried to continue his legacy, pushing even broader reforms, including a state-subsidized grain program and the extension of Roman citizenship to Italian allies. He met the same fate, pursued, besieged, and ultimately killed in violent clashes. From that point on, it became clear that the Republic had entered an era in which conflicts would no longer be resolved solely in the Senate, but also in the streets, in the assemblies, and soon on the battlefield. Rome began to divide into two great political factions: the Optimates, defenders of the Senate's authority and the status quo, and the Populares, who appealed directly to the people and sought reforms, often through extra-legal means. In this climate of polarization, ambitious generals emerged who began to accumulate power that exceeded institutional limits. One of the first to break the rules was Gaius Marius, a novus homo, a new man, meaning not of patrician lineage, who forever transformed the Roman army. Until then, only property owners could serve as soldiers. Marius changed that. He allowed any landless citizen to enlist, promising land in return for service. Thus was born the professional army, more loyal to the general who led it than to the Senate that appointed him. And although this solved a military crisis, it marked the beginning of the end for the traditional republic. Marius became a hero for his victories against the Germanic tribes, but his rivalry with another general, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, plunged Rome into its first civil war. Sulla, an aristocrat himself, also coveted supreme power and did not hesitate to march on Rome with his legions, an unprecedented act. He established a dictatorship and carried out mass purges against his enemies, publishing lists of proscribed men whose deaths were rewarded with bounties. Although he eventually restored power to the Senate and voluntarily retired, the damage was done. It had been proven that military force could be used to control internal politics, and as if the situation were not tense enough, Rome soon faced a war with its own Italian allies, the so-called Social War, 91 to 88 BC, when these allies demanded full Roman citizenship after years of loyalty. Rome won the war, but was forced to grant many of their demands. Citizenship expanded, but so did political divisions. Amid this fertile ground for chaos arose a new generation of politicians and generals who would ultimately bury the Republic. Among them, one shone brighter than all the rest: Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar was not only a talented military commander, but also a brilliant orator, a shrewd politician, and a strategist of immense ambition. He managed to align himself with the Populares without completely alienating the Optimates. Through an alliance with Pompey, the most respected general of the time, and Crassus, the richest man in Rome, he formed the first triumvirate, an informal power pact that allowed them to control the state without passing through the Senate's traditional channels. But this alliance would not last. After Crassus's death in a disastrous campaign in the east and the death of Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, the relationship between the two leaders deteriorated rapidly. Meanwhile, Caesar had spent nearly a decade conquering Gaul, modern-day France and Belgium, writing his campaigns in the third person in his commentaries on the Gallic War, works that not only chronicled his victories but elevated him to mythical status among the Roman people. When the Senate, under Pompey's influence, ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, he made a decision that would change the course of world history. He crossed the Rubicon. That small river became the symbol of the definitive break with republican legality. Crossing it with his army in 49 BC, he uttered the famous words, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast, unleashing another civil war. Caesar advanced on Rome, and Pompey fled east. Caesar pursued him to Greece and then to Egypt, where Pompey was treacherously assassinated. Meanwhile, Caesar was received in Egypt as a god and began his famous affair with Cleopatra, with whom he had a son. Upon his return to Rome, he was appointed dictator for life, a move that set off alarm bells among those who still dreamed of restoring the Republic. And then, in an act meant to save the Republic, the senators committed a fatal mistake. they assassinated Caesar on the Ides of March, 44 BC. They believed his death would restore order, but it only plunged Rome into another spiral of civil wars. What the senators failed to grasp was that Caesar was not merely a man, he was the embodiment of an irreversible transformation. There was no going back. The republican system, with its old norms, could no longer contain the new world Rome had created through its conquests, expansion, and power. The people, moreover, had loved him, and that ensured that his death would not end the conflict, but rather ignite the final chapter before Rome's ultimate transformation into an empire. When the senators plunged their daggers into the body of Julius Caesar, they believed they were killing a tyrant. They thought, whether out of conviction or convenience, that their heroic act would restore freedom to Rome. But what they truly killed was the last chance to save the Republic. For Caesar's death did not bring back the old republican order. It only plunged the city into a new spiral of violence, betrayal, and unbridled ambition. The power vacuum left by Caesar was immediate. Although he was officially only dictator for life, in practice he had already behaved as a monarch without a crown. His assassination left behind a broken political structure without a legitimate heir, or so they thought. Then emerged a figure who, to many, seemed little more than a provincial youth, Gaius Octavius Thurinus, Caesar's adopted son and designated heir. Octavian was only 18 when his great-uncle was murdered, yet from the start he displayed a lethal combination of political intelligence, cold blood, and patience, his greatest weapon. He did not rush headlong into power. Instead, he carefully won over the people who still revered Caesar, the army, who still respected the memory of their general, and, gradually, even those enemies who had underestimated him. Meanwhile, other figures were vying for control of Rome. The most prominent was Mark Antony, Caesar's general and right-hand man, charismatic and seasoned in the art of war. For a time it seemed he would be the natural heir to Caesarian power. But Antony made fatal political errors. He underestimated Octavian, alienated the Senate, and above all, failed to understand that the age of purely military strongmen was ending. Rome wanted order, not another conflict. In this atmosphere of tension, a temporary alliance arose, meant to stabilize the situation. The Second Triumvirate, formed by Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus. Unlike the first, this one was official and legally approved by the Senate. Together, they launched a brutal campaign to eliminate Caesar's assassins and all their political enemies. New lists of proscriptions were published, echoing Sulla's century-old purges, and dozens of senators were executed or driven into exile. Among the most notable victims was Cicero, the great orator and defender of the Republic, who had fiercely opposed Antony. His death symbolized the end of an era. Power was divided, but as with all alliances born of necessity, it could not last. Lepidus was quickly sidelined, and relations between Octavian and Antony deteriorated when the latter strengthened his ties with Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt and former lover of Julius Caesar. Antony not only established his court in Alexandria, but even went so far as to proclaim his children with Cleopatra heirs to parts of the Roman world. Octavian exploited this masterfully. In Rome, he launched an unprecedented propaganda campaign, portraying Antony as a traitor enslaved by a foreign queen's influence. Conflict was inevitable. The final war of the Republic was fought at sea, the Battle of Actium, in 31 BC. There, Octavian's fleet, commanded by his general Agrippa, defeated the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. Defeated and with no future, both took their own lives in Egypt. With them died not only a legendary love story, but also the last resistance to the rise of a new order. Octavian returned to Rome not as a conqueror, but as the savior of peace. He did not need to proclaim himself king or emperor. He was far too shrewd for that. In 27 BC, he theoretically returned power to the Senate, which, grateful and intimidated, granted him a new title, Augustus, the Revered One. He was also proclaimed Princeps, the first among equals. With those names, a new chapter of Roman history began, the Empire. And here begins one of the most fascinating periods of the ancient world. For although the republican system continued to exist in appearance, with its senate, consuls, and laws, in practice, all power now rested in the hands of the emperor. Augustus was the first to understand that it was not about erasing the past, but absorbing it, wrapping it in a new form of authority. His power rested on three pillars: control of the army, absolute command of the finances, and a carefully constructed moral authority. He was named Imperator by his legions, accumulated titles such as Pontifex Maximus, High Priest, and cultivated an almost divine aura around his person. He commissioned temples, reformed laws, promoted traditional morality, and restored ancient values that, in truth, had never fully existed. It was an empire in the shape of a republic, a dictatorship disguised as restoration. But this was not only about politics. The reign of Augustus was also a cultural golden age. Under his patronage flourished some of the greatest Latin writers: Virgil, who wrote the Aeneid, an epic portraying Rome as the rightful heir of Troy; Horace, with his odes to balance and reason; and Ovid, whose metamorphoses expanded the mythological imagination of the Roman world. It was an era of splendor, but also of surveillance. Ovid, for instance, was exiled for reasons that remain debated to this day. Augustus also launched an ambitious administrative reform. He reorganized the provinces, dividing the empire into regions under direct imperial control and others overseen by the Senate. He created a corps of loyal officials, established a more efficient taxation system, and transformed the city of Rome itself. Under his motto, "I found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble," he beautified the capital with forums, temples, and monuments that still dazzle the world today. Yet the issue of succession became a constant dilemma. Augustus had no male heir, and the successors he groomed, his nephew Marcellus and his grandsons Gaius and Lucius, died one after another. At last, he adopted his stepson Tiberius, a capable but somber military man, who inherited the throne upon Augustus's death in 14 AD. And so, a new phase began. The empire had not only been born, it now had to learn to endure. What Augustus had built with balance, intelligence, and legitimacy would soon be tested by those who followed. Unlike the Republic, where power was divided among temporary magistracies, Rome now depended on the character, passions, and decisions of a single man. The dream of imperial peace and order was, beneath it all, a tightrope, one that every emperor would have to walk without a net beneath his feet. With the death of Augustus in 14 AD, the Roman Empire entered a new era. The storm of civil wars had passed, and a new order had taken root. But now came the true challenge: maintaining that stability over time. The figure of Augustus had become almost sacred, and his legacy immense. Could anyone possibly live up to it? His successor was his stepson, Tiberius, a man of somber temperament, reserved, deeply military, and with little talent for the political maneuvering that Rome demanded. Yet Tiberius was a far better ruler than many of his contemporaries admitted. He preserved the empire's prosperity, consolidated Augustus's reforms, and avoided unnecessary wars. But his suspicious nature, increasing isolation, and growing repression of opposition eventually earned him the hostility of both Senate and people. Tiberius died after years of seclusion on the island of Capri, leaving power in the hands of a young man of only 25, who would soon shake the empire to its core, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known as Caligula. At first, his rise was greeted with enthusiasm. Grandson of the beloved Germanicus and raised among soldiers, Caligula seemed charismatic and full of promise. But the illusion did not last long. Rome soon discovered it was ruled by a profoundly unstable emperor whose behavior bordered on insanity. He appointed his horse consul, proclaimed himself a living god, ordered arbitrary executions, and squandered the imperial treasury on absurd spectacles and constructions. His reign was short-lived. Caligula was assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard, the elite corps tasked with protecting the emperor, in a conspiracy that included senators and palace insiders. Without consulting the Senate, the Guard proclaimed an unexpected new ruler. Claudius, Caligula's uncle, long considered a minor, stammering, and sickly member of the imperial family. No one had ever taken him seriously until he assumed power. Claudius turned out to be an efficient administrator, a lover of history, law, and reform. He reorganized the machinery of government, professionalized the bureaucracy, and pushed the empire's expansion, including the conquest of Britain in 43 AD, a milestone that would extend Rome's presence in the British Isles for centuries. Yet his reign was also marked by palace intrigues and one fateful choice: his marriage to Agrippina the Younger, mother of his future successor, Nero. Here, Rome entered one of its most fascinating and decadent chapters. Nero, who began his rule with moderation and the guidance of philosophers like Seneca, soon became one of history's most infamous emperors. Passionate about the arts, theatre, and music, so much so that he forced the aristocracy to attend his performances, Nero ruled with a blend of narcissism, brutality, and delusion. During his reign occurred the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. Legend says he played the lyre while the city burned, likely an exaggeration, but he did blame the fire on the Christians, then a small and obscure sect, launching the first great persecution against them. He ordered the murders of senators, relatives, and even his own mother, and his growing unpopularity made his rule untenable. In 68 AD, besieged by revolts and abandoned by all, Nero took his own life, leaving the empire in chaos. Nero's death ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty and triggered a brutal struggle for power known as the Year of the Four Emperors, 69 AD. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian fought for the throne within a single year. It was Vespasian who prevailed, founding the Flavian dynasty. A tough, pragmatic soldier, Vespasian restored stability to the empire. His reign marked a period of reconstruction and order. Under his rule and that of his sons, Titus and Domitian, Rome strengthened its borders, improved administration, and undertook vast public works. It was during this era that one of Rome's most iconic monuments was built, the Colosseum, eternal symbol of Roman engineering and culture. Titus, though he ruled for only 2 years, left a lasting mark for his leadership during 2 disasters. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, which destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum, and another great fire in Rome. His death, likely from natural causes, led to the reign of Domitian, whose government was more authoritarian and repressive, though effective in defending the frontiers. He was ultimately assassinated in a palace conspiracy. With his death in 96 AD, the Senate appointed as Emperor Nerva, an elderly senator who inaugurated what became known as the dynasty of the 5 good emperors. This period, spanning Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius, and, to a lesser extent, Lucius Verus, is often regarded as the golden age of the Roman Empire. Trajan, born in Hispania, was the first non-Italian emperor. Under his rule, Rome reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching from Scotland to the Persian Gulf. His conquests in Dacia, modern Romania, brought immense wealth and added a deeply Romanized new province. In Rome, Trajan's Forum and his Column, adorned with detailed reliefs of his campaigns, still stand as monuments to his grandeur. His successor, Hadrian, understood that limitless expansion was unsustainable. He governed with a defensive philosophy, consolidating the borders and traveling tirelessly throughout the empire. A learned and artistic emperor, Hadrian left his mark on cities as distant as Athens, Ephesus, Jerusalem, and Britain, where he ordered the construction of Hadrian's Wall to protect the empire's northern frontier. After him, Antoninus Pius reigned in peace and prosperity. His rule, one of the most tranquil in Roman history, was a model of efficient administration, justice, and moderation. Upon his death, the throne passed to Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, author of the Meditations, a timeless masterpiece of Stoic wisdom and introspection. Yet even during this age of greatness, cracks began to appear. Marcus Aurelius faced constant wars along the Danube frontier, as well as the devastating Antonine Plague, which decimated the population in many provinces. And most consequentially, after generations of adopting capable successors, Marcus broke with tradition by leaving the throne to his biological son, Commodus. Commodus's reign marked the beginning of a new chapter, the decline. Unlike his predecessors, he ruled capriciously, surrounded by flatterers and obsessed with portraying himself as a gladiator and demigod. He was assassinated in 192 AD, bringing to an end the cycle of golden stability. Despite the architectural grandeur, administrative sophistication, and general prosperity, the empire was already showing signs of exhaustion. Its borders were too vast, loyalties were beginning to shift from the center to the provinces, and both human and economic resources were faltering. Internal tensions, long held in check, were about to erupt. The 3rd century loomed ahead, bringing with it a storm of crises, usurpations, invasions, and divisions. Rome was about to face the most critical period of its existence. By the beginning of the 3rd century, Rome was no longer the invincible power it had once been. Behind the splendor of its temples, baths, and legions, there lay an increasingly unstable reality. The vast size of the empire, once a symbol of greatness, had become its greatest weakness. Maintaining the frontiers, ensuring supplies, managing internal revolts, and restraining the ambitions of generals and governors had become an almost impossible task. The death of Commodus in 192 AD left the throne in the hands of men who, in many cases, had not risen through political merit or legitimate succession, but through the favor of the army. Thus began a period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, an age of near-constant chaos in which the empire saw dozens of emperors in just a few decades, most of them murdered by their own troops. It was a time of civil wars, betrayals, and fleeting emperors. Power no longer depended on the Senate or the traditional Roman institutions, but on immediate military support. Any general with a loyal legion could proclaim himself emperor. The legions elected, deposed, and executed emperors like replaceable pieces. The empire lived on the brink of anarchy, and the very concept of authority began to crumble. Meanwhile, barbarian invasions became ever more frequent. Germanic tribes, Goths, Sarmatians, and Persians crossed weakened borders, sacked cities, and challenged Roman rule. As if that were not enough, another catastrophe struck the empire. The Plague of Cyprian, an epidemic that spread between 249 and 262 AD, decimating the population and plunging the economy and morale even deeper into despair. Trade stagnated, cities emptied, and many began to question the destiny of the Roman world. Amid this ruin, A few emperors tried to restore order through desperate measures and radical change. One of the most significant was Diocletian, who came to power in 284 AD. His vision was clear. The empire, as it stood, was ungovernable. His solution was revolutionary: divide the power. Thus was born the Tetrarchy, a new system in which the empire was split into two halves, each ruled by a senior emperor, Augustus, and a junior emperor, Caesar. This structure was designed to ensure defense and peaceful succession, avoiding civil war. Diocletian ruled the Eastern Empire, while his colleague Maximian governed the West. For a time, the system worked, but its foundations were fragile. Pride, ambition, and personal loyalties would soon undermine it. Diocletian also implemented sweeping economic reforms. He imposed price controls, reorganized taxation, and bound workers to their trades for life to halt the collapse of production. It was an attempt to freeze chaos through bureaucracy. He also strengthened the imperial cult and launched one of the last great persecutions of Christians, whom he saw as a threat to the empire's religious unity. Yet Diocletian did something unprecedented. He voluntarily abdicated in 305, retiring to his palace in present-day Croatia, where he lived out his days tending his garden. It was an admirable gesture, but one that no successor would imitate. No sooner had he stepped down than the system collapsed. New conflicts erupted for control of the throne, and amid the turmoil emerged a decisive figure: Constantine. The son of one of the tetrarchic Caesars, Constantine prevailed after another civil war and became sole emperor. His most famous victory came at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312, where, according to legend, he saw a divine vision promising triumph under the Christian symbol. That experience would change the course of Roman history forever. With the Edict of Milan, 313, Constantine legalized Christianity, ending centuries of persecution and ushering in a new era. He became the first Roman emperor to embrace Christianity, though his baptism came on his deathbed, and openly favored the Church, granting it privileges and protection. Under his rule, Christianity ceased to be a clandestine faith and gradually became the new spiritual core of the empire. Constantine also reshaped the political map. He founded a new imperial capital in the east, in the ancient city of Byzantium, which he renamed Constantinople. Strategically located between Europe and Asia, it would become the center of imperial power for over 1,000 years. Though Rome remained the eternal symbol, it was no longer the true heart of the empire. Upon Constantine's death in 337, his sons divided the throne among themselves, reigniting the struggle for power. Though the empire remained formally united for several decades, the division between East and West deepened. Two cultures, two economies, two increasingly distinct political systems. The Eastern Empire, more urbanized, wealthier, and anchored by great commercial centers like Alexandria, Antioch, and Constantinople, managed to withstand external threats. The Western Empire, by contrast, more rural, impoverished, and exposed to the Germanic frontier, began a slow but irreversible decline. By the 5th century, the situation had become unsustainable. The Roman army was no longer made up of Roman citizens, but of barbarian mercenaries, many recruited from the very tribes that would later invade the empire. The sack of Rome in 410, carried out by the Visigoths under Alaric, sent shockwaves through the ancient world. Rome had not been taken by an enemy force in over 800 years. It was a sign that the end was near. In 476, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, a young man named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer, who did not proclaim himself emperor but king of Italy. It was a symbolic break from the illusion of Roman authority. Though the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, would endure for nearly a millennium more, the Western Roman Empire had fallen. Yet to say that Rome fell is not entirely accurate. What fell was a political system, a form of governance that could no longer sustain itself. The cities, laws, institutions, and even the Latin language survived for centuries in various forms. The Christian Church, direct heir to the imperial administration, preserved Roman structures. Roman law remained the foundation of European jurisprudence, and the idea of Rome as a center of power, culture, and civilization lived on in the imagination of kingdoms, empires, and peoples that came after. Medieval emperors like Charlemagne and even the Russian Tsars saw themselves as heirs to Rome. The Roman dream did not die. It transformed. Rome was never just a city, nor merely an empire. It was a concept, a way of seeing the world, a civilization that, with all its light and shadow, shaped the course of human history, from a humble settlement by the Tiber to dominion over half the known world. From the Republican Senate to marble emperors, from the legions to the Christian martyrs, Rome was all that and more. And if we still speak of it, study it, and dream of it today, it is because in a way we are all still a little bit Roman.